The New Quantum Era,
a podcast
by Sebastian Hassinger
and Kevin Roney.
Welcome back to the podcast. This is Sebastian again, flying solo. We're doing a little bit of a rewind after the last episode where we talked to Paul Kadin-Zemansky about the International Year of Quantum. This is now a rewind to the final episode that I recorded solo at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute's launch of their on-premise IBM System 1 quantum computer. So I did a number of conversations there, recorded a bunch of them, and this is the final one. So this is a conversation with Anastasia Marchenkova. She has been active in the quantum industry for a fair bit of time now and has a really interesting background. This is a very wide-ranging conversation. I ended up choosing the title Careers in Quantum because I think Anastasia was on it, she did her PhD. She was sort of on a more traditional quantum physics experimentalist kind of track, and then took a sidestep into startup land, and has sort of gone from there. You'll hear more in the conversation. Super interesting. She's got really interesting perspectives because she's not from strictly an academic context and not strictly from a large corporate context, which are the two sort of dominant, I think, perspectives in the industry at the moment. So it's a really interesting conversation. You'll notice, I have to apologize here, I was new to the studio setup at RPI, and I was sort of concerned with making sure the recording was actually working. And listening back to the recording, I realized I didn't do a proper introduction. So I'm giving a little bit more context here because we just sort of roll right into the conversation and get going. But I think you'll enjoy it. So let's have a listen.
That you build, and building those bridges, building the connections. And I tell people I actually launched a course last summer, and cool. I called it Extroversion for Introverts.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
And turns out it's a big need for people in the field,
on the
right?
Nose.
Because
exactly.
So much of science is driven by connections, and they lie to you in school. They're like, oh, if you don't want to talk to humans ever, just like do science, do computer science. And then you get like 2 years into your career, you're like, oh, now I have to go convince the manager that I need a new hire, or I need someone to collaborate with me from another team on this project. Like, how do I work that connection, right?
Totally.
It's a hard topic, and I think we lie to people that social skills are not needed. Yeah. And then to me, my pitch obviously for the course is like, that's more important than the science abilities. Obviously, not entirely true.
You gotta do some marketing.
But you have to, right? And even as big as like your promotion packets and what you're like communicating. My advisor in undergrad was not a pleasant person to deal with, so we missed out on a lot of collaboration opportunities and papers because of that.
Back to your hiring thing. That's such that's a mystical art of hiring the right person who you can actually interact with and have a personal connection, because you're going to be able to collaborate more effectively. It's just by definition.
Yeah. There's a quantum company I know that they have scientists there that just refuse to speak to people. And I'm like, you can't do this. Where's the CEO? Why aren't they cracking skulls here saying, like, this is not acceptable. You are not in academia. And even then, academia doesn't tolerate that either.
No, to me, it's one of the biggest red flags, right? I mean, I look at certain companies and certain R&D teams in this space who are saying like, oh, no, we don't want to show any kind of like work in progress to anybody. We want to just launch with, perfect qubits. And it's like, guys, that's not like, show me another technology of this kind of like magnitude of leap ahead that was done in isolation by
Right.
any finite number of people. It like literally takes the entire planet collaborating on stuff
Right.
to actually make that kind of leap. It's just not, I just don't think it's credible. I think it's, to me, it feels like insecurity, right? They don't want to actually talk about like, oh, we don't know what we're doing with it. Here's a problem we don't know how to solve, which
Right.
is, I mean, it's sort of like Brene Brown, right? It's vulnerability is the superpower.
Yeah.
It's like, we don't know how to solve this problem. Guess what? You just exposed that vulnerability to a whole population that might actually find a way around where you're stuck. So,
No, definitely. If you're stuck or maybe you're not even positioning it properly, even outside of quantum, I work with companies right now in AI and hardware. And yeah, I push them to, release fast, right? Because what you're building this for this customer, your customer might not care.
Right.
In the end, right? And
Yeah.
and I think we were just talking at lunch about this is, especially in the quantum space, right? We talk a lot about the technology, but in the end customer does not care how you do the thing. You can call it unicorn, whatever.
Yeah.
It can be a quantum computer. It can be an alien artifact.
Yeah.
They don't care. Are they getting the results
Right.
out of it?
Right.
In the end. But then I also, there is value in the research and the audience,
sure.
For what I've been doing with some of my clients I work with. I'm like, we have to post about the research because if you're going to attract the scientists, they want to know who they're working with,
Right.
what technology they're working
Right.
on, that they're actually doing real results.
Right.
That's one audience. That's definitely a valid audience. But then there's the other side, right? The customers, the clients, and
Yeah.
how do we communicate to them? And quantum is still so far behind.
Yeah.
I've been going to conferences that are less quantum focused. So I was at South by Southwest
Right.
recently on a panel for quantum sensing. And I went around to all the quantum panels, right? And the misconceptions there of even people interested in the field but are coming from outside are still so high, and we are just not communicating well enough.
Right.
on
Well,
all
and
this
that's
stuff.
why I think what you're doing is so vital, right? I mean, you have a scientific background. You have a PhD. You're-
I actually don't. I dropped
okay.
out of my PhD.
okay. You were
Yeah.
enrolled in a PhD
I was
program.
enrolled.
That's-
I was enrolled. So my mentors were like, this is the perfect thing. My startup mentors, they're like, you're smart enough to get into the PhD, but smart enough to get out. And they're like, it's perfect.
Perfect. Perfect. But yeah, I mean, there's this huge chasm, right? I mean, if we only catered to what the customer wanted,
Right.
we would be doing generative AI.
Yes.
Right?
Which some have pivoted to that.
Some have pivoted to that, and there's
Breaking
no shame.
news.
But like, I think it's people like yourself who can help bridge that like imaginative gap
Right.
between, like the physicist not understanding that the end customer just needs a solution to a problem and doesn't care how it gets
Right.
solved, and the customer understanding that the physicist is working on something that's really, really hard to understand and has potential of being like super disruptive and super powerful, but needs patience.
Right.
and needs that sort of, like I said, that bridging function. I mean, it feels like that's a lot of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, through my own platforms, the idea was I just kept getting asked the same questions
Right.
over and over, and I got tired of answering them
Right.
over and over. So I decided
Sounds
to
like a
start
business plan.
writing, right? I actually started writing pretty early. I think I was still in grad school. It was 2014, 2015. And that's really when I started getting into the security space as well, because I was living in DC,
Right.
which is very intense in that. I was not a U.S. citizen at the time too, so that was also very fun. But it was a lot of these, okay, we've heard about quantum. We
Right.
know there's some overlap, but what is that overlap, and how
Right.
do you explain that to the audience? And to your point as well, I work with a lot of startup founders right now through incubators, right? First thing, you get a pitch deck, and it's just 30 slides of the technology. I'm like, I don't care. I mean, I kind of care
Yeah.
because, again, I'm a scientist
yeah.
and I think that's super cool. But in the end, I'm like, your customer doesn't care. The investor doesn't care.
Yeah.
It's what value are they going to
Right.
get out of it?
Which is such a startup mindset, right? I mean, that's like the lean startup. That's like MVP. It's like, release and like test with customers and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. And that's, where this field is emerging out of a scientific domain. And a lot of the people who are leading that are brilliant scientifically, but they have no experience with bringing products to market.
Right.
And and in fairness, it's not really a product yet.
Yeah.
It's an idea of a product. So it's very tricky. Even like technologists are struggling, like product people are struggling with how to deal with the state that quantum is in right now, it feels like.
Yeah.
So, do you see, like, how do you think, like, this whole sort of stage should be positioned? I mean, like, is it because you see, like you said, startup incubators. Sometimes I worry that it's sort of too early to start incubating startups, depending on what their actual value proposition is. But we're still pretty far from real economic like value generation, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting, right? So so I don't know if you know my background here. Why my career went off the rails
please.
in some way, but
Yes,
I did my
introduce
undergrad.
yourself.
Yes, I will
Anastasia.
introduce myself and my crazy career journey, and I'll
Yes.
try and tell the story in a way that makes sense. But I think one of the big things in my career that I was very lucky with my mentors is that they pushed me to try things. Because what's the worst thing that could happen? And so my undergrad actually, I science all my life. My dad was a physicist, right? So I always had that. I went to a magnet math and science high school because I wanted to work on the robots. And again, very lucky to have that experience where I had that support. I went to Georgia Tech early because I realized I'd kind of finished all the high school classes. I was like, this is not going to help me pick a career. And as I got into it, I was like, well, classes don't really help you pick a career. So I got into labs very early, and I actually started right after my first year in a quantum telecommunications lab. So I did neutral atom quantum memories for 3 years, which was really great to just have an advisor who got that early.
And that was Georgia Tech, you said?
That was Georgia Tech.
Cool.
And this is a question people ask me a lot. How did you pick quantum computing? How did you know this field would explode? It's a very frustrating answer to them because I said, I emailed one professor in the lab. It was a biophysics lab. And they said, no, you need to have taken optics. And I was still just finishing my first year. Second lab, again, I'm just like randomly emailing people in the department. Second lab, quantum information. I told them I could solder because I'd done that with robotics. They're like, great, come in tomorrow. And like, that's how I got into quantum.
Because of soldering.
Because of soldering, right? And it's just like those little bets and those little things. And again, I was lucky because having someone in academia, I knew how this worked, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, how do you get a lab position?
Right.
They're not posted anywhere. You have to just go ask.
Be useful.
Yeah. Ask, be useful, and just like put in a lot of hands-on work.
It's funny because, we had Dori Darnov on, and we asked the same question, how did you get into sort of quantum information theory? And she said, I think he was her advisor already, or she was considering doing her PhD with him, just handed her Deutsch's paper and said, you should read this.
Yep.
It's really interesting. And the next day she was like, well, I'm going to do that now.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just like going for it. So I was in the lab, and my advisor, it was like the first month I spent building laser locking boxes from scratch. And the first one took me 2 weeks, and then I got a lot better at it, right? And then after a semester, he handed me some papers, and he went, there's an empty room right there. Build this experiment.
Cool.
And
wow.
I mean, amazing amount of trust, right?
Yeah.
To have in an undergrad. But I think,
You must have soldered really well.
I soldered really well. Actually,
those robots, man, good background.
I mean, honestly, like those little skill sets, you'd be surprised. And the next year, I remember we had 4 PhD students come in. My advisor was notorious for being very difficult, and I didn't know that. I went to a conference and I told them I was in his lab. People were like, "Oh, you must work like 20 hours a day," kind of thing. So he was notorious for this. I didn't realize that at the time, but. Yeah, you did the work. You came in the next year. We had 4 PhD students come in. Only one survived the laser locking boxes. So I felt pretty good about myself after that one. And if you can kind of get through that laser locking boxes hazing,
right? Yeah,
you got through it. But so he was very open and just amazing people in the lab in general. Obviously, the PhD students were amazing. Still keep in touch with them to this day. We had
awesome.
great experience there. So. I always thought I'd be a professor. I mean, I even did research actually in chemical engineering for a while on drug delivery with microneedles. Because again, I was exploring and I just knew I wanted to like do stuff hands-on. And that's the only thing I'd figure out what I'm like. Mm-hmm. It was a fun lab, but I realized chem engineering wasn't for me because it was a lot of data analysis. I was just kind of staring at the robot arm, right? And what I was really looking for is something where I struggled, which also sounds very obnoxious, but... I took Python. I declared as computer science, I believe. Yeah, computer science major. I took Python, and I got like 108% in the class. And I was like, okay, this is great.
Oh, that's a humble brag.
Humble brag. Nobody believes I actually know how to do stuff. I promise, guys, I know how to do things. And, it was Georgia Tech too, so it was grade deflation. So I was like very proud of that. I had some coding experience, obviously, coming in. But I kind of sat there and I went, okay, computer science is great. computers are amazing, but I want to use this as a tool and not as my main field of study.
Yeah.
So then I started looking more into the sciences, and I went to bio for a semester. I did genetics. I was kind of interested in bioinformatics. So when I started trying the engineering stuff, I loved the classes actually. But again, that hands-on work is what really convinced me that I needed to go try something else. And what's the worst that can happen? You leave after a semester and you say like, okay, well, fun, not for me anymore.
Right.
You know, and I think
Well, you weren't. It doesn't sound like you were in a rush to just get through it. You wanted to find the right path that felt right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think I thought that at the time, but I was like, what's the point if you're not? And I never really, I guess, thought about the long-term career, but I was like, oh, well, like I grew up around so many academics. I was like, I'm going to go apply for a PhD and do that, and then I'll figure it out. Right. And I'll always get to work on something interesting then.
Right.
It's always going to be cutting edge. And then I got into physics. I was like, this lab is amazing, and, you know, did the degree there. Then my last year of college, I actually crashed the servers on my university, speaking of just doing stuff. Me and who eventually became my co-founder, but one of my high school friends and college friends, we had this little app that we built, and it became popular, and it was scraping data from the university database. And so one night we crashed the servers, and they blocked that IP address on like our app, and we were like, okay, then we'll just switch the IP address. So we DDoS the school, basically accidentally. So it was a very like Mark Zuckerberg story. We got called to the honor board, and we kind of were like, we haven't learned how to cache data yet. So it was basically rescraping the entire database, every user.
Oh dear.
It was horrible. Not even every user. I think like every page. It was horrible. And then we just kept switching IPs. Thank you, AWS. Finally, they figured out how to like block the range of IPs and shut it down. But a professor in the computer science department found out because he couldn't access his systems all night, and they basically had to send a postmortem being like, these two idiots like did this. It's not our fault. And they're like, if two college students can do this, maybe you guys should do better. But he was the founder of a company called Damballa, Dr. Merrick First. He was a professor in the computer science department, and he just opened a startup incubator. They just finished the first cohort.
Oh, cool.
And he basically called us up, and he was like, that was amazing. I'm writing you a check for seed funding.
Nice.
You're joining, right? And so I was like, well, this wasn't part of my plan, but it's a summer. It's 12 weeks.
Right.
I'd already been accepted to grad school, but I can just go over the summer instead of going there early. Why not? I got in there, and really like, and part of this discussion of, you know, extroversion is kind of important for scientists anyway. I remember coming in, they sat us down and the entire team, and they said, go outside and don't come back until you've talked to 25 customers. And as an introvert, as a scientist, I was like, no, I can't do this.
Right.
Like, no way. But I wanted to stay in the program, right? So I forced myself to do this. And
you're looking for things that made you struggle. So
I was really looking for things that made me
There you
struggle.
go.
Exactly. And he was one of the first people, and I think this is definitely a problem in education across the board. It's like the kids that are good at school kind of get left, not even left behind, but they're like, oh, you're good at it.
Not
we have to
challenged.
help.
Yeah,
we have to help those ones struggling. And he sat down and he was like, you're good. You could be much better. And frankly, like, you're not good enough yet.
Right.
And I was like, whoa,
Right.
Never heard that before, but it changed my life.
Yeah.
How he kind of took us and was like, you have to learn this. And then I started being around people who did not fit the stereotype, where there was someone who was in the cohort before me, 5 years older, had already started one company. And I was like, I respect this person so much for their technology mindset, but what he could do is he could help people see that vision of his product. And I guess this is also something where it's an interesting mindset now looking back, because I was like, instead of being like, oh, it's, you know, he's naturally charismatic, I was like, well, he's smart and he figured this out, which means I can probably figure it out, right? Like, I can just study how he did it. So as the nerd, I started reading books on how to be an extrovert, which is a crazy thing, but I was completely different. People still... The reason I built the course was because people are just like, oh, you're an extrovert. I'm like, no, I'm not.
Right.
I'm not. I have learned to fake it. And I've spent a lot of years studying. And at some point, yes, I stopped faking it. But actually, I'm still an INTJ on my, you know, to this day. I'm still testing that. No way, really. I feel like we flock together, the INTJs.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's supposed to be a rare one, but I know a lot.
I go back and forth between T or F. I
interesting.
score right in between the two.
Interesting, yeah. I've tested INTJ since like age 10. I'm still I, but like obviously I've creeped up over time on the E, but I'm still an I. And I also look at that in terms of like where I get my energy from.
Yeah, exactly. You got to recharge after you're around a bunch of people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I go home.
I see other people. You can tell in E, they're ramping up as they're exposed to other people, right? They're getting more energy. It's like, no, I've got a battery.
Yeah.
It
And I
runs
love
down.
talking to people in the
Yeah, me
field,
too.
right? Like it's such a good conversation. It doesn't seem hard, but yes, at the end of the day, I'm going to go back and I'm going to be like, I need an hour on my laptop to just like decompress.
Yeah.
And like, I need my internet
Totally.
time to be able to go to sleep or it's too much.
Yeah.
So so that's how I got into startups. And so we built that startup. I actually we started pitching. So again, I went through this like 12-week really rough process of like nothing you've learned actually matters anymore. You have to figure out customers. You have to figure out how to build this. And then I actually ended up deferring my grad school admission for a year because the company was going well. We had funding. So I was like, I want to kind of see this through.
Right. Yeah.
And again, every single time I was like, what's the worst case? Okay, I defer 1 year. My PhD is 1 year behind. A lot of people stay an extra year, right? It's not like I'm behind in life if that's what I still want to do afterwards. I'm not losing the admissions. Even if I do, I could reapply. Like I've done this before, right?
Yeah.
But here's a new opportunity. And that has kind of stayed over time. And so, then I sold the company actually. So after that year and a half, we ended up selling the company.
And was it a cybersecurity startup?
It was actually an educational technology. So we were helping. This was when Coursera and Udacity had just really started.
Yeah.
And we realized, and this was also taken from my experience, as a physicist, you have a lot of skill sets, but you're not the expert in any of them. So one of my jokes is that physicists are great coders. They're horrible software engineers because I training physicists to code, they can write lines of code and it will work, but you can't put it into production, right?
Right. No, it'll produce charts for a paper and then they throw out the code.
Right. And I'm like, this is not scalable. I was like, speaking of product leaders, right? I was like, they're like, we can just like zip this up and send it to customers. I'm like, no, we can't.
Yeah.
That is not acceptable as a thing that we're going to do. And so ended up selling the company. And with the educational technology portion of it, the issue was that as a physicist, I felt like I could do a lot of things, but I couldn't pass a coding interview. I couldn't pass an electrical engineering interview. How do we train people up to the next level? Because schools were not necessarily preparing people for careers, right? You take Java as a computer science major at Georgia Tech, I think is Java and C. But they're hiring for JavaScript developers, right? So how do you build up those skills? And so we worked with like online educational platforms and the actual, so there's the federal regulation, FERPA regulation, where schools can't sell data.
Right.
But because we were a third-party app, we could, right? So we asked our, people in our app, like, do you want us to help you find you a job? We can help you train you up.
Cool.
You can have free courses. We can help get your resume in a good place. And then to the companies that were looking, and especially coming out of Georgia Tech, it was a good place to hire engineers. We could say, like, we have people qualified and have taken extra classes.
Right.
It's going to be much easier for you to hire them out.
It's a good model.
Yeah. So we did that for a little bit. And it was a fun time. It changed my life, right? And then I went back to grad school because I was like, well, I don't know what to do now with my life, I guess. I'm going to pursue the career path that I always thought I would want. And then coming in with that experience was really interesting because, well, first of all, I was a little more comfortable than most grad students with some of that cash coming in. Like I had my own apartment and a luxury building and not living with 5 other people, right? And I also got the full ride scholarship, so I also didn't have to TA or RA.
Amazing.
So I was sitting there and I was kind of like, well, this is kind of boring. Like, what am I actually going to do?
Where's the struggle?
Yeah. What am I going to do for the next 5 years? And again, this is where I was really about seeking out mentorship. And I always looked for that. And I would go into the labs and I'm like, well, the professor's never here. So I'm going to sit and lock myself in a basement for 5 years. And I don't think that's a very productive way to do that. And then, start thinking about maybe I'm not a fit for this, life crisis at that point.
Right.
And I'd been talking to people there and they're like, it's looking back, I now understand what was happening, but they're like, maybe industry is interesting to you. So I started looking around and I was like, oh, maybe I could do software engineering or maybe I could do something. And then I discovered a little startup coming out of in California, just finished Y Combinator, 2 people, called Rigetti Computing. And
Familiar.
you're familiar now, but at that point, nobody was
no
familiar.
kidding. That was super early.
It was super early, so it was
I
2014.
guess D-Wave had been out had been funded for about 3 or 4 years, I think, at that point. But I think Rigetti was the second funded quantum startup that I'm aware of anyway. So
Right. So super early. And
very serendipitous.
I reached out, and at that point, now there's a quantum industry, but at that point, how many people there that had quantum and startup experience? Probably only me.
You were a unicorn on a unicorn's horn.
Right. And so I left, and I was like, this is an interesting opportunity.
Yeah.
So I was very early stage, so 2014, 2015 at Rigetti. And so it was interesting. Like, I moved all around the quantum stack too, right? So I did quantum telecommunication, neutral atoms, rubidium. Then grad school, I was like, I'm going to get into trapped ions. And then I went into superconducting and kind of went up the stack. And over the years after that, again, I just spent all my time being like, here's a gap in my skill sets. I need to fill it.
What did you do at Rigetti initially?
Everything,
It's
a startup. You do everything. I painted the column, the brand color, I did that, hiring, operations, and then also, in the technology side as well, right? And at that point, I'd also been, doing coding more and building all this stuff up. So I started getting to that place, getting all the lab stuff set up. Early stage, I still remember the Cryostat day, just getting that delivered was like a mess, right? And getting that all set up. And so, we did everything, which is also a very interesting phase. And now there's quantum startups everywhere. And I've also moved a little bit into the investing side as well. So I did an incubator for myself called VC Lab. So just to train emerging folks to, launch funds. And it's an interesting time because one of the issues I see with quantum startups right now is I feel like the hardware players are kind of already into place right now. They have the talent, they have the money. Okay, you're going to raise even if you do a huge Series A. I've seen 15 million Series A in Silicon Valley. You're still not going to really hire the best folks out there. Maybe you can get a good team.
Yeah.
Maybe there's someone coming out of the lab, but usually their professor is also starting the quantum company already has one on top of that, right? So it feels like the hardware players are already in place. The software is early, right? And I think that's the thing. It's I'm keeping an eye on some teams and startups in this time, and it's just a little early. And like you mentioned, the product is just not fully formed yet.
Right.
So what I see that companies that are successful doing right now is, we're in a really rare space where we have that DARPA, the non-dilutive funding, and people can actually spend a few years working on that and doing really well in the space. And I do think there's a space right now for startups kind of in the middleware. I warn venture capital folks, this is probably not going to be the billion-dollar company.
Right.
But there's still a lot of opportunity in that space if you want to do a company. But again, you have to build a product. You can't just do a research paper. That's not getting anywhere.
What's an example of middleware that helps me with the way you're defining that? Because it's a term that can be used in a lot of different ways.
True. Well, I'm thinking of things like Quantum Benchmark, right? They got acquired by Keysight, and they did they have a really good product for a very specific case that's going to be very useful. But the market size of that is just not there to
I also
level.
wonder about those types of plays setting an investor up with visibility, right? I mean, because if you have skin in the game, even if the opportunity size isn't, the $1 billion range or whatever, you're in the space and you're seeing it evolve, and you're through that startup, you're getting a sense for where the market as a whole is and the traction points and I think you have to be pretty close to the industry to understand, for example, the neutral atom logical qubits, the LDPC superconducting logical qubits, and now the Honeywell trapped ion logical qubits. They're not all the same thing. They're really different.
Yep.
And you have to be really close to it to start to understand, what does that mean for the forward progress, and is it just in one direction? Is it just we're heading towards logical qubits, or actually are those three things sort of pointing in three different directions? Do you think you get that kind of an investor can get that kind of insight by being on board with a startup at this point?
That's interesting. I actually consulted recently for a VC firm, and I not sure they made the right decision, right, on that. Because usually I would just be like, call me, I'll tell you everything. Like, we'll just have a talk and I'll tell you where we are in the market.
You would have given away the information for free?
Yeah, I mean, they called me anyway to talk through the pitch deck, right?
Yeah.
Because again, a lot of the investors, they get a deck and they send it to me. They're like, I have no idea what these words are. But it's interesting. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of companies popping up right now. Well, not popping up. They've been around for a couple of years, but coming in from the cryogenic side, which again, right, you start seeing being so connected.
Yeah.
So I can see the venture capital folks also looking like that. In the last few months, a lot of acquisitions in the photonic space, right? So unless you're kind of plugged into the market, you don't really, I'm curious, right? And you because we see the research and these things, you're like, oh, now I think I know where they're going.
Right, yeah. You can connect the dots.
Exactly. But it takes a long time for an investor to kind of get into the space, and especially the higher level. And of course, at the higher level, they're going to be looking for the market traction and just making sure that they have the talent and everything to actually succeed. But there's a lot of pressure, right? It's a lot of pressure. And I think a lot of quantum startups don't think enough where, I see some of these deal sizes and I'm like, you just raised a $15 million round. What revenue do you need to get to the next stage? What's your runway? And how are you going to get there? Like, I'd be stressed because I know how this works. Yeah, you can maybe raise off vapor, but the industry has changed. The market has entirely changed right now. And be careful. And latest company I started was bootstrapped for that reason because I was like, I don't want to deal with this, at this point. Eventually, obviously, for hardware, you do need a lot of funding. And again, there's the talent issue right now. Google can buy up whoever they want. IBM can buy up whoever they want and just put them there and just be like,
hang out.
You hang out. At least you're not working for the competitor, right? That's a strategy that companies have used in the past.
You mentioned DARPA. I just want to return the loop back to that for a second. Like, do you think, especially on the hardware side, as you said, there's sort of you get to B or C rounds, and you're talking about huge amounts of money. The private capital markets are not the most welcoming right now. Do you think that makes the public sector sources of funding even more important at this point for on the hardware side in particular?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. It's non-dilutive funding, which is amazing. They're kind of your first customer, guaranteed. Yeah. In the contracts, there's always a licensing agreement if you can get to a point, which is great, right? And if you get connected in those spaces, that's I talk to people about like, why do you actually want to start a company, right? And especially for scientists, sometimes they don't realize what that entails. And it's like, do you actually want to be a CEO or do you want to step away? Or do you want to be in the lab? Like that's totally, these are totally valid paths, but like, what do you actually want? Do you want to build a company for 3 years, sell it for 10 million and like have a chill life? Totally valid. But that's again, not a VC. Like I would not go for VC if that's your goal. And having been in the space now for a long time and seen it over and over, right? It's so mind-boggling to me. Like being in Silicon Valley, we're both there, right? I have friends selling companies for hundred millions, they get zero. Yeah. And everyone's like,
people do not understand.
They're amazing. Congrats. Like we're going to go party. And they're like, I am miserable. I spent 10 years of my life on this. None of my employees got any cash out of it. They may have gotten a good agreement.
Out of the cap table. Yeah, I know.
And I'm like, well, my friend sold their company for 10 million and they kept 90% of it. Yeah. They're actually doing better, right? But it's not like the trendy thing. And people are chasing around trends and yes. And so, I mean, those funding options are fantastic. And I think a lot of these, it's actually a meme that I posted not long ago, which is like, you're hiding an engineering services department in your deep tech startup, aren't you? Right. So again, these are different business models, right? It's like, what is actually scalable? Obviously, the first company that builds a quantum computer is not going to have problems with customers. Right. I just think it's going to be very hard for a new company to take over at this point. And again, the software is early, but I think a lot of quantum companies are also missing using that classically. So we were talking recently about, I'm working with some companies in the AI space, but they're actually shifting to a new computing paradigm, thermodynamic computing. So they came out of the Google quantum groups. Super interesting,
That's,
right?
Verdun, right? You're Guillaume, I think?
Actually working with Normal, who's Patrick Cole's. Yeah.
Competing with Guilbert.
Competing.
Two
Spicy.
players in the thermodynamic computing space.
Yeah, it's a spicy topic there, but it's super fascinating, right? And I think one of the things we've been talking about at this conference we're at is how much quantum is enough to teach, right? What can quantum actually be applied to? And again, customers don't care if it's quantum, if it's thermodynamic, if it's anything. Are we getting the job done?
Right.
So I think there's some of these companies that are actually doing something very smart is they're saying, where can we apply this to classical technology? Or is the simulator enough and we can still sell that product and wait.
Right.
And those are the companies that I think are going to have more longevity in the space.
Yeah.
So it's super interesting. I was talking to a company recently about that where they've built a very specific simulator, 200 qubits, not a universal. Obviously, that would take so much RAM to run that. But for their very specific customer and use case, it's a game changer.
Right.
Now, when they have the hardware, they flip it on.
Right.
And it's going to be huge.
And that was the Bleximo value proposition in a sense, right? It was
exactly.
like purpose-built machines that were not universal, but they were tailored to a specific algorithm or use case.
Exactly.
I thought it was super smart. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. But you're actually getting more expansive and saying like, take something learned in the quantum information science space and apply it to a thermodynamic or some other kind of exotic, maybe even just straight classical technology and get the economic value out of it that exists right now.
Yeah, why not? And I think that's something that I've started approaching problems with where and this has been my theory. So I worked in graph theory and HPC for a while. And it was because, so as a startup, this company I worked for, we were one of the top 25 Google customers and we spent millions a month on Google Cloud. So it's a lot of money because of all the data we were processing. And I learned this, I was like, this is a lot of data, but we have to do it right. Right now, and this is still happening, but because I was in that space, I see this little lining starting to appear where a lot of companies just throw GPUs, CPUs at problems still. They can get away with it. They don't have that much data. But the amount of data is growing. I'm seeing the companies that are running up against it, whereas I was part of the R&D team, and it was 2 PhDs in computer science and 2 physics people. And we were locked in a room and we were told this is slow, go figure out math to fix it, right?
Yeah. Math is up.
Spend 3 months on one problem,
right?
And it was funny sometimes that they're like, oh, you only submitted one line of code or one commit in 3 months. I was like, that commit saved $2 million a year. Leave me alone. But that's, data is not going to get smaller in the world. It's only going to get bigger.
Yeah.
More companies are going to start running into it. So I'm like, the ones that really need it already. And that number is just going to expand. So what do we do? I mean, we were working on the level down on the hardware. We were still in the cloud, so we were, still switching chips. But I was like, what if we built an application-specific classical for that, right? And so the thermodynamic computing value proposition is very specifically for AI energy consumption. Huge issue. Already running into that. Costs are prohibitive. Honestly, I've been talking to folks that, who are doing it. They're like, we don't have chips anymore. I don't know what we're going to do. This is going to end very soon. Huge problem to solve. And now everyone's using AI, right? And so I'm stepping back. I'm everything needs, it feels like the next era is just going to be application specific in general, whether it is quantum, right? It's and
optimization,
right?
Resource optimization,
right? Yeah. And that's all we've been working on with quantum. But I'm let's take a step back. This is huge.
It's a bigger problem. Yeah.
This is so important to do. And Bleximo, we've always said this, but even now there's been more of this QPUs, right? They're going to work alongside supercomputers and data centers. They're not going to be just in the research lab. You're going to have to work with all these other chips, and I think that just market is just going to expand over time.
Okay, so that's a very good setup for a closing question, which is So I mean, you've described this. This narrative in terms of your kind of personal path. What do you see as your next? What do you want as your next struggle, and what do you want to be when you grow up, Anastasia? I mean, you've done so many different things. It feels like you got your choice of just about any path forward, if you like.
And honestly, it's a very obnoxious problem to have, but it still is a different problem to have. And I literally last night, I was like changing my Twitter and Instagram bio. I'm going to be launching a new series. You can hear it here first because I actually haven't talked about it anywhere
Excellent.
yet. But the idea is, first of all, I want to start talking outside of quantum. Like, I'm so enthusiastic about these chips and the thermodynamic computing and other hardware. I work a lot with deep tech startups, so I want to expose more people to that. So I want to launch one, like a series on very, very deep tech topics outside of just quantum. So thermodynamic computing coming up soon. Talking to a few folks in the space being like, can we do like a broader industry thing? And then I want to do lab tours series. I want to get the cameras into the rooms and being like, this exists. And this is part of I have a business right now helping companies with media. It's like with hardware startups, I'm like, you're overthinking this. Post a picture of your hardware on Friday. People love it, right? Like once you actually show the hardware, it's real.
Right.
And I think just getting more exposure to deep tech, making it cool. Again, like I connect to the investor space. They're always like, tell me the new deals kind of thing. So I want to really reach out. My friends are working on such cool companies. So I'm going to launch that and then do deep dives on these like new industries, cutting edge industries, go through the papers and be like, this is the hallway conversations that we have. Besides that, I'm pretty, in some ways, like you mentioned, I have my pick, but I'm also unemployable because I have too many of my own ideas and nobody wants to deal with that. They want me to sit down and, do this thing. So yeah, over time, I definitely want to, I'm going deeper on the investor side. I don't know what that's going to look like over time. And there's regulations that say even if I knew, I can't talk about it yet. So that's one aspect of it. And
well, and I mean, it sounds like, communication and trying to connect those disparate kind of communities. Back to where we started, it's trying to connect either the scientist or the technologist to the end customer and explain both sides to the other, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And I have this like deep desire. I'm like, I kind of want to start a venture-backed company again, but I'm trying to really first step back. One of the cool things about being online is getting exposure to all these sort of different problems and industries. If I find the right topic, I might do that, but 10 years is a long commitment. That's how I look at it. And so I'm excited to kind of take this space to the next level and really help with brand position and branding, helping scientists get the word out there, because that's how I feel like I can 10x myself. Like I've created a platform. I think I've done hopefully a decent job explaining quantum to people in a way that like I haven't been banned from quantum conferences yet, so I might be doing an okay job so far. But how can I enable other people to do that as well? And that is helping scientists launch their companies, telling them how to do the pitch decks, making sure they raise properly, making sure they build the companies properly, talk about the value. And that's kind of my like expansion on there. And yeah, and having fun so far while I'm doing it and having a good time. Still like sit down sometimes and I'm like, I want to write a paper or two.
Right. You still have a scientist inside?
Oh, I do. But yeah, I have this like long term. I've been really like trying to think about Brian Johnson. I saw him on Friday in Santa Clara last week or Saturday. They were doing a roast of Brian Johnson. And he said something really interesting about how he doesn't work for the approval of people today. He works for the approval of the people in the 25th century.
Wow.
And I was like, that's interesting. Like, what do I build on that? You know, and for me, education has always been a big component of it. Like, helping companies, well, what does that 25th era look like? I have this video game. I love Alpha Centauri back from 1999 that I still play from time to time. And there's a faction called University of Planet.
Oh, yeah.
Or the researchers, right? I'm like, I need to build that tech tree. Like, what if we create a university of like the high tech topics? We talk a lot about AI, software eating the world, but I don't remote all this. People are always going to live in houses. They're always going to need stuff. Manufacturing is huge. So I want to make sure we have education in that space as well and build that up. I don't know how yet, but in some way that's like something in the back of my head.
The questions are more interesting than the answers in some way, right? I mean, there's your struggle, right? That's the thing you're trying to set up.
It's
Well,
it's yeah
thank you
how we do
so
that.
much. I feel like we could keep on going forever. So many topics, but I really appreciate your time, and this is a great conversation. And I'm sure all of the things you are doing are going to have fun and do all kinds of valuable stuff for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it for this episode of The New Quantum Era, a podcast by Sebastian Hassinger and Kevin Roney. Our cool theme music was composed and played by Omar Costa Hamido. Production work is done by our wonderful team over at Podfi. If you are at all like us and enjoy this rich, deep, and interesting topic, please subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you may stream from. And even consider, if you like what you've heard today, reviewing us on iTunes and or mentioning us on your preferred social media platforms. We're just trying to get the word out on this fascinating topic and would really appreciate your help spreading the word and building community. Thank you so much for your time.